Hello everybody and welcome back to another video on my channel. Clear skies to you all. It's been absolutely cloudy and rainy, but I might be able to get my first night here in a couple of nights. For the first time in nearly 2 months. It's been absolutely horrendous weather here in Utah, but that's just how it goes sometimes. But today we're talking about cameras for astrophotography, the different types of cameras that are out there available on the market today, and also some of the expectations that you can have if you have one or the other, or if you're looking to invest in something a little bit different. So let's get into it. As I said, we're here to focus on cameras today for astrophotography, and there's basically three main types of cameras that you're going to be looking at, or that you may have readily available to you. You're going to have the dedicated deep space camera, which is this big red looking thing. They come in different sizes, different brands, different colors. Of course, this is just a ZWO, which is famous for its anodized red aluminum bodies. You have DSLRs, which are common with Canon, Nikon, Pentax, Kodak, etc. And then you also have point and shoot cameras, which are just the little baby cameras that you can fit in your pocket. They're very small, very lightweight, and the profile is very tiny. Now, this is a Canon, but they do have Sony equivalents and also some other different varieties. And what you can expect, though, is a lot of people are not going to go after a point and shoot camera. However, these cameras are typically what a lot of people have laying around, though. They have these because these are easy for vacations. They've had these before they really got their first, let's say, their iPhone Pro or their Samsung Galaxy Pro, where you have a lot more advanced of a camera system. These little point and shoot cameras, though, aren't half bad, though, for certain applications, though, in astrophotography. For example, the full moon is very easily achievable with one of these. These have this one specifically has a 40 times optical zoom. So that equates to somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 millimeters of focal length. Well, 900 millimeters of focal length is more than enough for you to get the full moon on one of these little guys. Now, is it going to be outstanding? Is it going to be, absolutely incredible, like if you were looking through a telescope at it? Absolutely not. The optics in these are just one set of optics for the entire range of basically just native all the way to that 40 times optical zoom. So once you get to the very tail end of that 40 times optical zoom, things can get a little bit fuzzy, a little bit soft right at the very end. But that doesn't mean it should stop you from trying to use one of these to take a picture of the full moon. Or maybe if you just have a glimpse of an eclipse and you don't have a professional grade DSLR or something that may capture higher resolution, one of these actually will do you just fine. If you're using one of these, though, for something like Milky Way shots, you're not really going to have much success. A lot of these can only do usually 15 seconds at most. Some of the newer ones can do RAW format shooting, which is absolutely amazing and incredible that they're introducing RAW into these little baby cameras. But the biggest issue is of course, without a star tracker, these are going to blur. And of course, the biggest issue, though, is ISO. ISO essentially just stands for the sensitivity that the camera is able to adapt to. So basically, it goes from ISO, usually they start about ISO 100, either Canons or Nikons, point and shoots, DSLRs, they all start about ISO 100. That means that's the lowest sensitivity to the chip. And then you change the exposure speed of the shutter based off of that. So if you're ISO 100, you're out in the full sunlight, you're probably going to stop it down to 1/1000th of a second, maybe even shorter, to dim that light down enough that you can capture your object. Well, the nighttime is the exact opposite. You want higher ISOs, longer exposures in the end. One of these little guys, this one can only do ISO 3200, which isn't bad, but in terms of today's standards, these DSLRs of today's world go to something like 120,000 ISO. So the sensitivity is, 12, 15, 20 times as sensitive as one of these little things anymore. So that's the disadvantage for using one of these for astrophotography, aside from something just like the full moon. So if you have one of these, you can absolutely give it a shot. And here's a photo that I took the other night of our full moon peeking through the clouds, so you can get just somewhat of an idea of what you can expect with one of these. Now moving on to DSLRs. DSLRs are probably one of the most popular cameras on the face of the earth. We've also got mirrorless versions of DSLRs. DSLRs still use the single lens reflex. That's just how they are by native design. But DSLRs have set the standard for how cameras should be, and DSLRs are no slouch when it comes to astrophotography. DSLRs in today's world are very sensitive. They have very good chips in them. You can buy a variety of camera lenses that do different things for you. Camera lenses are one of the most vital parts of your entire camera system. The problem, though, with camera lenses is not all camera lenses are created equally, and the price points are dramatically different depending on the brand, the type of lens, do they have focusing in them, are they manual focus, etc., 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 etc. There's 100 different things that go into camera lens price points. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's say you go to Costco or BJ's or Best Buy, wherever you go that has a DSLR camera. You say, I'm going to buy this. It has a kit lens, the standard. We're going to talk about a Canon since that's what I'm familiar with. With Canon, it has an 18 to 55 and a 75 to 300. Those are usually the two kit lenses that you'll usually receive in your package at one of those retailers. So the 18 to 55 is going to deliver you a relatively wide field to a somewhat medium power field of view, but then your other one is going to be a 75 to 300, so you can get a lot closer to the target, but 300 millimeters is going to be your top end amount. The moon is still only going to be probably the size of a quarter at 300 millimeters, just simply because of how small the diameter of one of these are. 300 millimeters zoomed in all the way is really still going to be quite small. So it's not really a bad thing. It's just you need to set that expectation that you're not going to be able to, shoot like a full moon eclipse with one of these without having to crop down the photo to make it larger, maybe do some enhancements, to pull out the detail of the resolution. So the kit lenses aren't bad. The biggest thing I want to mention, though, is their F number, which stands for their focal ratio. Usually, typically, with one of these camera lenses, they have an F number. That means the diameter by how far the light travels in the, usually this would be referred to as an optical tube on a telescope, but same thing, a camera lens. How far the light travels from A to B, and that's what makes the difference in the millimeters of focal length. But once you use simple math and combine those numbers together, you'll get the F number. The F number denotes how wide your aperture is. All that really means to us is how much light is coming through. Same thing with telescopes. The higher the F number, so F10, F15, let's just use F10 since that's a pretty common size for a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, and F10 is going to deliver a lot less light on a 30-second exposure than something like an F2. F2 is going to be just dramatically brighter than an F10. And the lower that F number is what you're really looking for when you're talking about camera lenses. The other thing with one of these camera lenses is you can get simple wide field targets like Orion Nebula, you can get the Rosette, you can get the Pleiades with one of these. You just have to, like I said, use a star tracker, use longer exposures, stack them together, and you need to create that little bit of expectation that you're not going to be able to just go out, put it to 300 millimeters and snap the Orion Nebula like that and not have any issues at all. Now, DSLRs, they have a multitude of lenses. They have a multitude of settings that you can use. This on here is an IRIX 15 millimeter, and this is an f2.4. So again, really attractive F number, f2.4. Now, these ones are typically, the IRIX ones are typically manual focus only. You'll have a dial on top. You'll have to dial that focus for your needs, depending on the target of acquisition. Now, the nice thing, though, about a lot of these lenses is they do have a spot for infinity if you do have a manual focus lens. Usually infinity is what you're going to pick for the night sky. Or if it is close to where the focus point is going to be for the night sky, you can at least turn it to infinity, turn on your live view, and then, magnify a star and really dial the focus in that way. One of these 15mm lenses, though, will give you a very dramatic wide field image of the night sky. This lens in particular on my full frame gives somewhere in the neighborhood of close to 100, 120 degrees from corner to corner. So you can get a landscape, a nice, really tall view of the night sky above it. You can flip it into portrait mode and get almost directly overhead all the way down to the horizon. So it's really a nice camera lens to do a lot of wide field work with. One of the big things about DSLRs is there's two types. There's the crop sensor, there's the full frame. The crop sensor just means it's a 1.6 reduction of a full frame. Full frame meaning full 35mm equivalent, size of a chip. It's a real big chip. The only problem with full frames, and this is the only reason why I bring this up, is because recently I had to replace my crop sensor Canon 80D with a new camera, which is a Canon 6D Mark II, and that's a full frame, is your crop sensor lenses will not work with a full frame usually. And in terms of a Canon, I can't really speak for Nikon, but in terms of a Canon, the way you can designate those is most crop sensors they're an EF mount, but it's -S. That -S usually signifies that it's a crop sensor lens. Those do not fit on the full frame because you'll have vignetting on the sides dramatically, because the exit size, basically the exit pupil, you can kind of say, on the back of the lens is so much smaller than what that big wide chip of a full frame can handle. Vice versa, you can always use a full frame lens on a crop sensor, because that illumination, to get that really wide field on the chip of a full frame, is just reduced. So you'll lose the outer edges. So basically your field of view just becomes narrower if you take a full frame lens and put it on a crop sensor camera. Now, some of the settings that you can use for astrophotography, particularly retaining to DSLRs, is you have to remember basically two big things: what your ISO is and what your shutter speed is. Your ISO, like we talked about a little bit earlier, is just basically the sensitivity of what the camera chip can see. Now, every camera, every DSLR, every mirrorless, etc., every chip has its own perfect ISO. And this depends on the make and model, so they all vary. Certain models have ISO of this, of that. They all range, like I said, usually between 100 to about 100 and some thousand, depending on how recent and new your camera is. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of these cameras, especially for astrophotography reasons, you're not going to be going over really ISO 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, depending on your camera. The higher the ISO, usually the noisier the image becomes. So if you take an image that is done at ISO 3200 and you take 30 seconds and you get a nice photo of the Milky Way, it's a little bit dim, but you have you have nice stars, you have good color, you have, nice detail, versus a photo that, let's say you crank it up to ISO 100,000, same 30 seconds, it's going to be so bright and blown out. But you'll notice there's graininess all over the image, and that's just simply because the higher the sensitivity of the chip that you set it to, the ISO, is going to suffer from image quality loss. Typically, the lower the ISO, the better the definition you'll get. Hence why, during the daytime, DSLRs are great, because the ISO is so low, the shutter speeds are so low, the images are so clear and crisp, and you have good colors, and you have, a really nice outcome of photos. And that's exactly why. So there's different websites that show you ranges of your perfect ISO. And you can, of course, go and research those a little bit further to find out what the sweet spot of your particular camera is. The other thing is your shutter speed. There's also websites that you can calculate the perfect exposure time based off of your focal length of your camera lens. And if you're just using a regular tripod, it will calculate and it'll tell you, okay, if you're using a 10mm lens and you're not tracking, you can do an exposure of 22 seconds before you'll start to see the stars blur. And those are really good. Now, like I've said, the higher the number of the focal length you go, though, that exposure time will come down dramatically. So if you're at 300, you may only get a 3-second exposure before it starts to blow the stars on you. You can modify DSLRs as well, and what that means is that inside of every standard DSLR, when you buy it from a store, there is a UV IR cut filter on the front. There's an IR cut filter on the very front. Some have both UV and IR, some just have just IR. But the point is that you can modify these where a camera service will take out that filter for you, and then you'll see what they call full spectrum. And that means you'll see everything in the night sky, from hydrogen alpha, visual light spectrums, etc. Now, the only bad part is that you have to buy additional filters and stuff to use them for daytime. So if you're modifying a DSLR, you've got to make sure it's primarily just for nighttime astrophotography, because I had my previous one modified, and to be honest with you, I could never get it to take decent daytime photos again. The color balance was always off, the white balance was always off, I could never get the temperature to be right, and it was just an utter disaster. And your next option is a dedicated astro imaging camera. And what are the differences here? Well, this camera here is actually a crop sensor instead of a crop sensor DSLR. So it's the same size chip, except this is fully modified to do all light waves and spectrums. This one is obviously still has the filter in it for daytime. You can do some astrophotography on stuff that does not require such wavelengths like hydrogen alpha and such. DSLRs that still have this filter installed, you're going to be limited to things like Orion Nebula, the Pleiades, clusters of stars, constellations, Andromeda Galaxy, things that don't require that H-alpha, oxygen 3, you know, some of those gaseous, really hidden wavelengths of light that these filters block. But dedicated astro cameras see the full spectrum from A to Z, the entire way across the night sky. The only difference with these are usually very, very expensive. They come in two varieties. They have a cooled and a non-cooled. A cooled version, which is what this is, usually has a fan on the back, and it will cool the sensor down to a lower temperature to keep that sensor down, because as a sensor heats up, whether it be a dedicated astro camera or a DSLR, the more longer exposure photos you take, the heat from that chip slowly rises. What happens when it slowly rises is you introduce more noise, unless you've got a cooler on there, which is what a lot of these dedicated astro cameras do. Because of that, they can keep the chip down, let's say at -10 Celsius. They can keep the noise down. What are some of the advantages to one of these, though, is that you've got the ability to hook it up to some of the newer technology like ASI Air, do things based off of Wi-Fi. You can, of course, this has a integrated dew heater on the inside that keeps it from freezing and fogging up if it detects moisture building on the camera lens. You can also get an adapter, hook these up to camera lenses, and create, you know, photos with camera lenses, but using your dedicated astro camera. The only bad part is astro cameras are very, very, very expensive. This ASI 2600 is their crop sensor version of their full spectrum camera, but this has a lot of the advanced features with, like I said, that built-in dew heater. You got all the technology with really low noise. You have no glow, any of that, but it's a nice big chip in there. And basically what the difference is, though, this camera by itself is almost $2,000. It's very, very expensive. But the photos you get from this will dramatically beat out the photos you get out of a DSLR, just simply because a DSLR, you can't really circumvent that heat unless you install a cooler and basically modify your DSLR really heavily. So at that point, the question still rises, why don't you just invest in one of these? Have your DSLR for all of your other projects, have your dedicated astro camera for this project. Deep space cameras, typically they're only one ISO. There's no adjusting the ISO on one of these. You only can adjust the exposures. But these are really good because when you put these in a telescope, you can take as long of an exposure as your heart desires. These are usually hooked up directly to your power supply of your mount. So unlike DSLRs that run off of battery power, you can usually get, 200 shots or so out of a DSLR, depending on how long the exposures are. You have no issues with getting these to work all night long with no problem, just as long as your power supply, either if it's hooked to the house or if it's just batteries that'll last all night long for your mount and everything. These also allow you the ability to hook different peripherals up. So you can hook up different USB supplies, you can hook up your mount to this, you can guide with these type cameras. So they're really helpful in a lot of different ways. But these dedicated Astro cameras do by far have a better chip in them. They have a higher dynamic range than DSLRs do. They have a higher ability to capture low light sensitivity. They have a much, much better noise matrix in these. So they're very, very low noise. And that is coupled with that cooling that we talked about. And the biggest thing about these, though, is that they weigh about the same as a DSLR. They're just crazy more expensive. It's the only bad thing. But dedicated Astro cameras, though, have come a really long way in the last probably 5 to 10 years. We used to have things like the Meade DSI, which was the deep sky imager, back when I really first started dipping my feet into the hobby of astronomy. And that was 10, 15 years ago. We had the DSI, which was a decent camera at the time. It had its issues. It had its, compatibility issues. The software wasn't great. But as we've evolved along, these newer ones can take images that are almost noise-free. They're amazing with what they can capture. And you have the ability to use basically any filter you want. Nebula filters, you can get a monochrome version of these deep space cameras if you want to do monochrome imaging versus one-shot color. So there's all types of different things that you can use one of these newer modern-day cameras for. Because once you go to the deep space camera, your lens on your DSLR becomes your telescope. This is now your camera. Your lens is your telescope, and your star tracker is now an actual mount, like an Ioptron mount, a Skywatcher mount, a Paramount, whatever mount you're using to guide and track the stars for your long exposures. The biggest debate is, do you do one-shot color or do you do monochrome? And a lot of people favor one and the other. A lot of people have transitioned from one to the other, and it is totally by preference. One-shot color sounds exactly like what it is. You have one photo, it's capturing R, G, and B. Those are your color spectrums. So they're capturing all the light at one single photo. And the problem is you may have to do a lot more of those photos to get the same equivalent as you would on a monochrome camera. Because a monochrome camera, you have the ability to put a filter on the front that's a red filter. You take the photos. You have a green filter, take the photos. You have oxygen, take the photos. It goes in that sequence. Versus one of these, it's RGB all the time. Or you put your filter on the front, and that now pulls out the hydrogen alpha, the hydrogen beta, the oxygen into a format that these one-shot color cameras now see and see vividly. And so it will capture that data now in those wavelengths, but just in the color format. So there is no right and wrong way, though. And a lot of people have had this debate, do I do color, do I do monochrome? There is no right or wrong answer here. It is your personal preference. I chose one-shot color when I started, because it was easier for me to learn on a filter, learn how to process those different wavelengths, learn how to create an image from a one-shot color. You do have to do some other different work around it, but I've learned those little quirks about a one-shot color, and I think that the photos that I personally take are really good, but that's my opinion. You need to be proud of your own work, and that's what matters the most. I'm so happy that you guys watched this video, and I'll be sure to post more astrophotography related content here soon. And hopefully here in the next couple of weeks, I'll be able to get out with this new imaging rig and my brand new camera, which I still not have yet gotten to try out. And we're going to give it a go and see what type of photos we can capture here in the near future. So as always, clear skies to you, and we'll see you next time.